Thanks, Rich. Good morning, everyone. And yes, it is the first Sunday in Advent today, but we are going to spend 2 more Sundays on the Ten Commandments. So next Sunday, Colin is going to be speaking to us on the 5th commandment, honour your father and mother. And then we'll get into Christmas stuff through into January, and then we'll resume the Ten Commandments series in January and do the second half then. So we've come today to the longest of the Ten Commandments, occupying a whole 4 verses. So I'm going to read that in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So 3-part message. Firstly, just going to look at the commandment itself and try to understand how it was observed in ancient Israel. Then we'll have a brief look at the Sabbath as it developed through history. And then finally we'll try and think through the more tricky issues of application as we attempt to answer the question, well, what does that mean for us today? Has the Lord's Day replaced the Sabbath? Is there something special about Sundays? Those are the questions we'll get to in the final part. So it is important, and it's also quite topical. So let's jump in. So the commandment itself. Verse 8 gives you the basic instruction. Remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. And by telling them to remember, there's an implication that they already know about it. And indeed, on their journey to Sinai, God had provided manna 6 days out of 7. And he'd already told them that the 7th day was meant to be a holy day of rest. So back in chapter 16, verse 23, Moses said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until the morning. So they were already observing the Sabbath in some sense. It wasn't a totally new idea to them. And the word holy just means set apart. That means a day that is to be different from the other days of the week. So they already had experience of it, although now it is a command. They're to remember the Sabbath day by setting it apart as different. How are they to do that? How do they remember the Sabbath? Well, verses 9 and 10 tell them how they're to do it. Firstly, they're to work for 6 days. Firstly, yes, they were to work for 6 days. By that, I don't just mean our paid work. I'm referring to all our household chores as well, the shopping, the gardening, the car maintenance, and so on. That all comes under work. And God has given 6 days to do that, to fulfill our earthly vocations. So the Sabbath command, it starts with a command to work. Work for 6 days. And it's worth saying at this point that work is not a result of sin. Work was present before the fall. God put Adam to work in the garden, didn't he? Before sin entered. But I know we have a bit of a love-hate relationship with work. You know, I owe, so it's off to work I go. Work fascinates me. I can sit and stare at it for hours. But we are created to work. We need to work. We need to be productive, busy, useful. And that's why laziness is a sin in the Bible and unemployment is a curse. often contributing to poverty and poor mental health. And the notion of retiring at 50 to go and sit on the beach is not a Christian dream. Sorry. Resist it. I'm sorry if that comes as a disappointment to you. But we were made to work. So the fourth commandment starts with a call to work. But then it goes on to say that God has set one day apart. This day is to be different, special. And there are two elements to this day. First, it's a day set apart to the Lord your God. It's his day. It belongs to him. And later on, as more laws are given through Moses, we see that it's a day for corporate assembly. This is quite important. Leviticus 23, verse 3 says, "There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You're not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord." But that verse in Leviticus introduces this idea of meeting together. It's a day for corporate assembly. The Sabbath was set apart then as the day to do business with God, and that meant gathering together. And the other element flows from this. You see, in order to spend time with God, there had to be a ceasing from work. So one follows the other. Remember the Sabbath is the command. How do we do that? Or how did they do that? By ceasing from work. It wasn't a day for business as usual. It was a time to step back from the busyness of life, to reflect on God's goodness and his grace, and to meet with God's people. And I'll come back to that later. And then the final part of the command, verse 11, the reason is very simple. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and then he rested. We work and rest because we're created in the image of a God who works and rests. Now, it's not an argument for a literal 6-day creation. I don't want to get into that this morning. But it does emphasize the pattern of work and rest. Now, did you know there is no evidence for anything like this in the ancient world? As far as we can tell, there's no precedent or parallel anywhere outside Israel. The Sabbath day was unique to Israel. The only conclusion we can draw is that God invented it. Other societies followed the annual cycle of the sun or the monthly cycle of the moon and had different festivals related to those natural cycles. But here in the Bible we find the origin of the 7-day week. And here we are, still with us in the 21st century. We still base our lives around 7-day weeks, don't we? That's how we think about life. We think in terms of weeks, 7 days. And God has put that there. There's nothing in nature that it reflects. It's simply a theological fact that God has put it there. And there have been attempts to get rid of the 7-day week by atheists. The writer Voltaire said once, "If you want to kill Christianity, you must abolish the Sabbath." So after the French Revolution, they tried to introduce a 10-day week. You'd work 9 days and then have a day of rest. But it didn't catch on. In the Soviet Union, the 7-day week was abolished in favour of continuous work with staggered days off. So everybody would be working, or somebody would be working every day, and then people would take their day off on a sort of a rolling basis. But again, that too was a failed experiment, and the 7-day week was reinstated. It's because God has hardwired it into creation. There's nothing in nature that explains the weekly cycle. It is simply there because God put it there. And so the Sabbath Commandment then is a double corrective. On the one hand, it says to the wealthy elites of the world, get off your sun loungers and do some work. We were made to work. On the other hand, it says to the workaholics, slow down and cease from your labour. You need to learn how to rest, and if you don't, you will burn out. So the Sabbath command then is a gift to all workers of the world. It was certainly a gift to the slaves. It was certainly good news for slaves who had to work every day. One scholar says the Sabbath has been the greatest social revolution in the history of humanity. Maybe so. It's God's provision for a world that is weighed down by toil and the burden of work. So that's basically the commandment. Let's think briefly about its history, a brief history of the Sabbath. This is going to be a bridge so that will help us think about how we apply it today. Obviously, the Jews took it very seriously. Certain activities were regarded as work and were to be stopped, like gathering and preparing food, ploughing and harvesting, and buying and selling. In Numbers chapter 15, we read about a man who was stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath. He went and gathered wood for a fire on the Sabbath, and he was stoned to death, which does seem rather harsh. But we don't realise how big a deal it was. It showed a disregard for the God who commanded the Sabbath to be kept and set apart as holy to the Lord. The Sabbath, as I've already said, was one of the things that marked Israel out as distinctive. And in the book of Nehemiah, when he went back to Jerusalem, he found that the Jews were starting to do trade on the Sabbath with surrounding people groups. And Nehemiah stopped it immediately. He shut the gates so that trade could not take place on the Sabbath. It wasn't a day for commerce. And the Jews were treating it like any other day. They were forgetting the Lord. So very important throughout Israel's history. And it did eventually catch on in other cultures. Although it was enforced in Israel from the time of Moses, the idea of a day of rest proved very popular as it spread. Eventually the Greeks and then the Romans adopted it. Of course, they didn't use it to remember the Lord. It was simply a day to cease from work. But it did catch on. So what about the New Testament? What does the New Testament teach us about the Sabbath? Well, firstly, Jesus supports the humanitarian aspect of the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2, where he says, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's why Jesus went around doing good, healing people on the Sabbath, even when it was forbidden or regarded as work. It's a day for lifting the burdens of life. And so Jesus was very critical of the Pharisees in particular because they'd added all kinds of rules and regulations as to what you could and couldn't do. Jesus corrected their misuse of the Sabbath, but he never abolished it. Indeed, he observed it himself, as did all the early Christians who were, of course, Jewish. But what we do see, however, in the New Testament, as Christianity and Judaism begin to diverge, the focus shifts away from the Jewish Sabbath, the seventh day, to the Lord's Day, or the first day of the week, Sunday. In the book of Acts, we read about believers gathering on the first day of the week, the Sunday. This would have been a working day. Presumably they would have gathered early in the morning before work or later in the day after work. Then in Paul's letters, he assumes that churches gather on the first day of the week, as he talks about getting your offerings ready for the first day of the week. And then in the book of Revelation is revealed to John on the first day of the week. It says, it was the Lord's day when I received this vision. And it's obvious why this switch happened. This was the day Jesus was raised from the dead. Sunday was resurrection day, the Lord's day. What could be more appropriate than meeting on a Sunday? But there is a very sort of practical reason as well, and that is that the Christians were no longer welcome in the synagogues. So although Jewish believers would still observe the Jewish Sabbath on a Saturday, they would also meet with Christians on the Lord's Day. And as Christianity grew throughout the Roman Empire, the pattern of work and rest became established. And then in the year 321, the Emperor Constantine officially made Sunday the day of rest. Thus, resting from work and going to church, as it were, became possible on the same day for the first time. So that's a little bit of historical backgrounds. How then do we apply the Sabbath today? The Sabbath in the modern world. Basically, there are three positions that you can take. Firstly, we can take it literally. We can celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, which is still the Jewish Sabbath. It's what the Seventh-day Adventists do. They meet on Saturdays. Now, I used to play cricket in Derby with a Seventh-day Adventist, but never on a Saturday. That was his holy day, not a day for playing cricket. He only played on Sundays. I played both days. Because, well, for two reasons. One, I didn't have any scruples about playing on Sunday. And two, I was single and had nothing else to do. But I don't think the Seventh-day Adventists have got it right. It goes against the teaching of the New Testament and the practice of the church for the last 2,000 years. Some churches have tried to have Saturday night meetings. It rarely works. But anyway, so that's the first view. Take it literally. Second view sees Sunday as the replacement Sabbath. So this is now our Sabbath. On this interpretation, the fourth commandment now refers to a strict observance of Sunday. Think of Eric Liddell in Chariots of Fire, refusing to run his heats on a Sunday because it was against his religion. And there's an earlier scene in the film which kind of sets you up for that. When he comes out of church and he sees some boys playing football, and he stops them playing, takes the ball away, and solemnly declares that the Sabbath is near day for football, is it, lads? And it's a view with quite a long history. The Puritans from the 16th century onwards, they were strict Sabbatarians. But, I'm not sure this is the right view either. There's no evidence that the Lord's Day replaced the Sabbath. In fact, both existed side by side, as they still do today. For Jews, the Sabbath is still Saturday. It's always been Saturday. It's the seventh day. So the Lord's Day hasn't replaced the Sabbath, although many Christians would argue that it has. The third view emphasizes a Sabbath principle rather than a specific day. So they would say the Sabbath itself is of no relevance to us because we're not Jews. What matters is the pattern of work and rest. There are no special times or places anymore. God is everywhere. All space is sacred. You don't have to go to a special building to find God. All of time is God's gift to us. There aren't special times. We're to make the most of every opportunity. The important thing on this view is that we have time off work. And it doesn't really matter on which day you have your Sabbath, your rest, as long as you have one. Now, for most members of the clergy, since Sunday is the busiest day of the week, the rest day tends to be Monday. I always had Monday as my Sabbath for many years. I met other ministers who had Wednesday as their day off in the middle of the week, and then others who would have Friday off, so they get a long weekend. Well, it doesn't matter which day you rest from work, just make sure you do. So those are the three views. We need to remember that the purpose of the Sabbath was twofold. It wasn't just a day to cease from labour and to rest. It was also a day set apart to meet with God's people. And so I do find myself drawn back to the importance of Sunday, or the Lord's Day, as it is called in Scripture. It may not be the Sabbath, but it is still the Lord's Day. And I think the challenge that we've found in recent years is that Sunday is just like every other day. A day for work and shopping and leisure and sport and DIY and gardening and studying. I do remember Sundays as a child. Nothing ever happened on a Sunday. All the shops were shut. There was no sport. Yeah, it was very, very different to what it is today. How do we keep Sunday special? It's just a few thoughts to close with. Firstly, I'd say don't bring work home for the weekend. Draw clear lines between work and rest. If you need to work the weekend, you're working too hard anyway. It's not sustainable. We must be different. We need to take a stand against the 24/7 nature of work. It destroys lives, it weakens community, and it threatens churches. Secondly, prioritise meeting with God's people. We only have one service. Surely it's not too much to expect. Can you imagine if we had 2 services on a Sunday? Of course, we need to be flexible. We need to understand that some people have to work Sundays. Some jobs have to be done 24/7. Of course, we understand that. Not everyone can make a Sunday. That's why midweek meetings are important too. But there is something about Sundays, and I was trying to nail this down. What exactly is it that cannot be replicated at any other time? And I think it comes down to a couple of things, and that's the preaching of the word and worship. Small groups primarily meet for fellowship and encouragement. The purpose of the larger gathering is to hear God speak through his word. That's what was happening at Sinai, wasn't it? God had brought them to the mountain so they could hear him speak. And corporate worship is a precious thing. Worshipping God together. Yes, I know Jesus is present whenever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name. But there's something powerful and faith-building when we're all gathered together to sing God's praises. Preaching and worship cannot be replicated well in small, home-based gatherings. And of course, during lockdown, people got out of the habit of meeting together, and after the novelty of Zoom had worn off, we realised it was a very poor substitute for actually meeting in person. Attendance rates at churches have been plummeting for decades. So whereas in earlier generations, people would be in church on at least once on a Sunday, every Sunday, now they reckon the average is twice a month. We need to reclaim Sundays, I think. So prioritise meeting with God's people. Thirdly, use the Lord's Day to do good to others. Jesus did good on the Sabbath. The Pharisees said, only intervene if someone's life is in danger. Jesus intervened just to do good to people. We should use the Lord's Day then to welcome the stranger, to feed the poor, to visit the sick. It's not limited to that day, obviously, but it's a special opportunity, I think. A day for hospitality, a day for serving one another. Fourthly, remember God's goodness. The 10 Commandments are repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, but the reason for the command is different. Whereas in Exodus, it's creation. In Deuteronomy, it says, remember the Sabbath day, because once you were slaves in Egypt, but God brought you out. He delivered you. It's based on our redemption. Let there be a weekly reminder of God's grace to you, of how he rescued you. He redeemed you. And that's what we sing about primarily, isn't it? Is that we've been redeemed in Christ. It's also a reminder of where our true rest is to be found. As Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He's the ultimate source of rest, true rest. And that's the fifth and final thing. Observing Sabbath rest is a pointer to ultimate heavenly rest. There's a long sort of argument in Hebrews 3 and 4. We won't turn to it now, but if you want to read it later, please do. It talks about our ultimate rest as still being in the future. And it says we must make sure we don't fall short of it and perish through disobedience. And our weekly rest gives us an opportunity to reflect on the life to come. That God has made us for eternity, and one day we will rest from our labours and we will be with God in his presence forever. And many people make work their God or their idol. But the fourth commandment is a reminder that God is the one we must value most, because we're created for relationship with him. So, to sum up what I've been saying, this is what I think is the Bible's teaching on this. Yes, there is a Sabbath principle of work and rest. Make sure you have a day of rest. And do whatever you need to do to restore your soul. If that means going for a walk in the Peak District, reading a book, listening to music, do what restores you. Whatever you find relaxing and restorative. We need that as human beings. All humans need that. That's a word for the world as well. You know, we mustn't be slaves to work. But it's only one part of it. There's also an expectation that as Christians we will meet together on the Lord's Day to assemble as his people, to hear God speak and to respond in worship. That's why Sundays are still important. And that's why we must not give up the habit of meeting together. Amen. Hope that's been helpful.